Welcome to Sparks of History, where Jewish history and world history meet. We are very pleased and honored to have with us today Rabbi Yaakov Taubes. Rabbi Taubes earned a BA in History and Jewish Studies from Yeshiva College, additionally an MA in Medieval Jewish History from the Bernard Revel Graduate School of Jewish Studies, and Rabbi Taubes received rabbinic ordination smicha from the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary. And Rabbi Taubes is currently working on his dissertation in medieval Jewish history. Rabbi Taubes currently serves as the rabbi at Mount Sinai Jewish Center and is an assistant director at the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary REITs at Yeshiva University. Previously, Rabbi Taubes served as the Orthodox Union OU Jewish Learning Initiative on campus, educator at the University of Pennsylvania Hillel, a position he held along with his wife for 5 years. Rabbi Taubes, thank you for being with us. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
And today we're going to be taking a look at one of the fascinating Bible Torah commentators, Rabbeinu, and we'll pronounce it this way, Rabbeinu Bachya ben Asher. Just to start off, generally speaking, Rabbi Taubes, who was Rabbeinu Bachya ben Asher?
So we know very little about him. One of my professors once said, you always have to qualify what you mean when we say we don't know so much about someone. That can mean different things depending what period you're talking about. So even in a period where we don't know a lot about many Jewish figures, even the more famous ones, we know very little about their life and times. Even with that metric in the medieval period, sometimes known as the period of the Rishonim, in this case in 13th century Spain, even with that qualifier that we don't know so much about many people, we know very little about the biography of Rabbeinu Bachya ben Asher. We know, as I mentioned, he's in the 13th century. His major commentary, which we'll talk about in a moment, his major commentary on the Torah, we know was written in 1291, or at least started in 1291 or finished in 1291. We can talk about that in a moment. So we know that's when he lived, what year he was born. You'll sometimes see in encyclopedias a list that he was born in 1260 or 1270. There is no true basis to support that other than he must have been at a certain age before he wrote the work, before he wrote the commentary, but there's not too much basis for what year he was born in. We also do not know what year he died in. None of those things are clear. In terms of other biographical information, even his true name is somewhat subject to debate. You pronounced the beginning of this podcast, his name was Bahya. The letters, the spelling is Beis Ches Yud Yud, and there are a number of different ways to pronounce that. There's Bechai, Bachi, Bachya, Bachyi, Bechaye. These are all different candidates, I guess you could say, or suggestions for how to spell the name, how to pronounce the name. None of them have 100% good basis of what they're supposed to be. The common yeshivish way of saying Bechaye is probably not correct. I think that developed, as far as I can tell, as a way of distinguishing him from the other, probably more famous Rabbeinu Bachya or Bechaye, and that's Bachya ibn Pekuda, the author of Chovos Levavos. It's worth saying at the outset they are not the same person. You see this misconception less often nowadays, but you see it all the time, even in some Sfarim, where they'll say, oh, the Bachya of Chovos Levavos in the commentary on the Torah. They are certainly different people. Bachya Pekuda lived significantly, or almost 2 centuries earlier. In case there's any doubt about this, or there's any suffix whatsoever, the later Rabbeinu Bachya, as in Bachya ben Asher, the one that we're talking about today, cites the earlier one. So there's no question they are different people. If you needed any further resolution of that point. So sometime the earlier one, I think in standard yeshivish pronunciations, the earlier one goes Bachya and this one's Bachaye. That may have developed to differentiate, similar to what you have in the yeshivas of Rambam versus Ramban. We put the emphasis on the first syllable versus the last syllable. That's just how something that developed, standardization developed to distinguish them. Bechai also obviously is a word. Bechai Beis Yisrael, Bechai Beis Yisrael. You have that language in Kaddish and other places, but it's probably not correct. It's probably Bachya is certainly the academic standard consensus. Again, that doesn't mean 100% it's correct, but that's usually what's preferred and what's used, Bachya. In terms of what that name is, this has also bothered people and bothered scholars for a long time. What kind of name is this? It's not totally clear. There is another Bachya who's mentioned, Bachya in Bakuda. We have someone else with that name, someone named Bachya ben Moshe, who lived in Saragossa. We'll get to that in a few moments. He was one of the signers of the ban in favor of the Rambam. Maybe you've had a podcast about this a different time, but what's known as the Maimonidean controversy, or one of the renditions of the Maimonidean controversy. So scholars who were in favor of the Rambam's philosophy, as long after Rambam was dead, wrote a ban, banning, a counter ban, I guess you would call it, against those who opposed the Rambam. So among the signers, or leaders of the signers of that counter ban, is a Bachya ben Moshe. And there's a couple other Bachyas from Spain, but it is not a common, certainly not a common name. There is a manuscript that was first brought to public attention by Reuben Margoliot, the great scholar and librarian. People may know his from Margoliot Sayam, a very important sefer on Sanhedrin, Masechet Sanhedrin commentary, and many, many other works that he wrote. He brought to light a manuscript of one of Rabbeinu Bachya's works that said his real name was Yehuda, and that Bahya was just a nickname. It's hard to completely ignore that manuscript because it is an old manuscript, and it's unlikely someone would make that up. On the other hand, we have no other attestation that his name was Yehuda. We have people during his time period already who call him Bahya, and there's no other mention that his name was Yehuda. So again, can't ignore that manuscript. It is certainly possible that was his true name, but it's hard to rely upon that by itself. So we don't exactly know how to pronounce his name. We're not 100% positive of what his true name was. What about his father's name? Well, Bachya ben Asher, that would seem to be pretty clear. It seems from his Hagdamos, from his introduction, that he says Bachya ben Asher. The only problem with that is that later in his commentary, he quotes something in the name of Aleph Nasan. Aleph is usually an acronym for Adoni Avi, my master, my father, Nasan. So it's a bit of a problem. So some say, well, maybe in the introduction, the way it should be read is not Bachya ben Asher, it's Bachya Beis Nun is an acronym for Ben Nasan, the son of Nasan, Asher, and then the poem continues, or then the line continues. You found some early scholars suggested that. It does not seem likely that that's correct. Probably his name was Ben Asher. That seems how he's referred to elsewhere. And that Aleph may be quoting his grandfather. It could be his grandfather, Avi. There's a recent dissertation about Rabbeinu Bahya of my good friend Idan Pinto in Israel, just completed earlier this year. So he suggests that perhaps it's Achi, his brother, his name was Nasan. He had some other indications to corroborate that. Either as it may, chances are his name was Asher, so Bachya ben Asher. You'll often see in his name that Ibn Chalawa, that he was part of the Chalawa family. Many manuscripts attest to that he was from the Chalawa. Certainly the printed editions say that. We also have a attestation of this from the son of the Maram Chalawa. People may know the Maram Chalawa wrote a very, very important commentary on Psachim, very popular in the yeshivas. His son wrote a commentary on the Torah. It's not clear if he finished it and only part of it survived. He only wrote part of it. We have this from Bereshis. And he quotes Krovenu, our relative, Bachya ben Asher. So that indicates, again, he was part of the Chalawa family. There is also a commentary on Shira Shirim from someone who claims to be a descendant of Rabbeinu Bachya, who is also part of the Chalawa family. So we know he was part of this family in Spain, Ibn Chalawa. Other biographical details, he is called in many places a dayan, a judge. It is possible that they're confusing with Bahya ibn Pakuda, the earlier one, who we know was a dayan. Bahya himself, the commentary, the one that we're talking about, Ben Asher, never calls himself a dayan, but there are already some early Rishonim who reference him as a dayan, as a judge, so it is possible he had that role. Beyond that, where did he live? We know he dwelled in northern Spain. That seems to be corroborated by who he interacted with. He spoke Arabic fluently. This is something that people don't always realize. The knowledge of Arabic in Spain at this point, Spain is now under Christian control in the period of time that we're talking about. So Arabic at this point is not the standard language among Jews there. That language had really been forgotten. There's a big question. Did the Ramban actually speak Arabic? He certainly knew some words, but it's not clear the Ramban had Arabic. When he uses words that were written in Judeo-Arabic, that is Arabic with Hebrew characters, he is usually using in translations. For example, with the Mor Nevuchim, the Rambam's Guide for the Perplexed, the Rambam Sefer Mitzvos, other works like that. When the Ramban cites them, he's doing it in translation. Bachya certainly spoke and could read Arabic. He mentioned some Arabic works that he translated himself. Does that indicate he had family or that he was born in southern Spain under Muslim control? Certainly possible. We don't really know. There is an idea that he was from Saragossa. You can find that in some of the early Jewish so-called history books, Sefer Yuchsin, and other places that mention he was born in Saragossa, this town in northern Spain. It's not clear where that comes from. Do we have any proof to that? Bahya seems to have been a popular name in Saragossa. We have some other Bachyas from Saragossa, so it at least provides some evidence that's where he came from, but we have no other evidence. Part of the big problems with figuring out his biographical information is he's not mentioned in too many contemporaries and halachic writings or in shuvos or that kind of thing, kind of a genre. That's sometimes the way we know about Jewish figures is their citation in shuvos and responsa. He is not mentioned in any responsa that we've uncovered. We don't have any responsa by him. We also have extensive, nowhere near complete, but we have extensive records, Spanish royal records, legal documents, etc., that have been edited and have been printed. You can get access to them in a good library, and they make no mention of Bachya either. So we really have very little to go on in terms of his other biographical information.
Do we have any idea who his teachers were?
Yeah. So in terms of teachers, he mentions his Rebbe many times was the Rashba. Shalom ben Avram ibn Aderes, then the Rashba, who was by far the greatest Talmid Chacham of the 13th century, late 13th century in Spain, early 14th century, who was probably had no official role as a crown rabbi. You sometimes see him referred to as the crown rabbi of Spain. That's probably not likely, but from Barcelona, which was a very important city in Spain during this time, and the kingdom was not really Spain, there was no such country, Spain yet, I should point that out. There are various kingdoms, Kingdom of Aragon being the primary one. So from Barcelona, the Rashba was the Rav and Posek. I mean, thousands of tshuvos from him, besides many, many other works. So Bachya many times quotes his Rebbe, the Rashba. So it seems that was who he studied with. Pointed out other places, we have to be a little bit careful when we say someone was a Talmud of the Rashba. There are many people who are called Talmidim of the Rashba. Does that mean they sat in shir, they sat in class by the Rashba, like we would say nowadays? It's not totally clear. We have to be very wary of that. We don't know if the education system worked that way. Someone was the Talmud of the Rashba, could mean they listened to shirim from them. And I once mentioned this in a different shir. Nothing with Bachya, there's a later darshan or preacher named Rabbi Yaakov of Sicily, Yaakov Sicily, who started off in Spain and then traveled elsewhere. He wrote a sefer called Torah Samincha, which is a collection of drushos that he gave for Mincha. When they republished his drushos about 10, 15 years ago, on the cover, it just says, doesn't even say his name, they just wrote Talmud Rashba. He's a student of the Rashba. If you look at his biography, he was maybe 20 when the Rashba died. Now, does that mean he didn't study by him? I'm not saying that, but it also could just mean the Rashba was the Gadol, who was the Talmid Chacham of the age. So Rabbeinu Bachya quotes the Rashba many times as his Rebbe. I don't mean to place that on that, but whether that means he studied with him in a formal way or just heard stuff from him or read his Svarim, I can't say more than that because we don't have any interactions between them. But the Rashba was certainly his main Rebbe. We mentioned he quotes his father. There's also someone named Rabbeinu Dan Ashkenazi, suggests from Germany, who had come to Spain. And he mentions him a few times as well as his Rebbe. So that's what we know about his teachers.
Okay. Let's go now to his works. What were his main works, and what was unique about Rabbeinu Bachya's commentary on the Torah?
So his most famous work is the commentary on the Torah, as was just indicated. That's certainly where his fame comes from. It was popular already in its own time. It exists in about a couple dozen manuscripts. And remember, if someone's going to go to the trouble of copying something, that usually means people wanted it. So it seems to have been popular. It is also widely cited during its time and afterward. It's worth mentioning when we get to the age of print, it was published in the year 1492 already, which is fairly early on, if you consider when the printing press came to be and when the early Jewish books are. 1492 is pretty early in the history of print. It was published a number of times in the next century as well. Continues to be popular nowadays. For what it's worth, the Art Scroll Stone Chumash quotes it by my very unscientific count, at least once every 2-3 pages. So it's definitely up there with Rashi and the Ramban. So that's certainly his most famous work. Well, I guess we'll talk about that further in just a moment. His other very important and famous and popular work is called the Kad HaKemach. It's a work that's very close to my own heart and research and my own research. It's an alphabetically organized Jewish book, which worth mentioning that is not common in the medieval period among Jews. Outside the realm of dictionaries, glossaries, those kind of works, you have very, very few Jewish books from the medieval period of the Rishonim that are alphabetically organized. I think we kind of take that organization system for granted nowadays, but it was very much not norm back then. He wrote an alphabetically organized work in sometimes called an encyclopedia. Chaim Chevel, who did the critical edition, I'll talk about that in a moment, did an abridged translation into English of this work and published by Shiloh. I think it's still gettable. He called it a Torah encyclopedia of Torah. Encyclopedia is not a great word because that word doesn't exist in the any medieval lexicon, certainly not in Hebrew, but it gives you a sense that there are entries. So for example, under the letter Aleph, you have entries for Emunah, faith, Ahava, love, Orchem, guests, Avel, mourning, Avelus. Under Beis, you have Bracha, blessing, Bitachon, Beis Knesses, etc. 60 entries in total in alphabetical order. And each entry contains material related to the name of the entry. It's not encyclopedia in the sense that it doesn't define terms. So for example, let's say you were going to write an encyclopedia article about Hanukkah, Ches for Hanukkah. You would not start off presumably talking about the Gemara in Shabbos, which discusses the story of Hanukkah, right? Everyone knows that Gemara. He never tells you the story of Hanukkah in that entry. Presumably you know that already. It's midrashim and ideas and content about Hanukkah. The purpose of this book, which we can talk about further, was to provide what we now call chomer lidrush. Let's say you're a rabbi who needs to give a drasha, needs to give a sermon about a particular topic, and you're looking for material. You could pick up the Kad and go to it and find material related to what you're interested in, and therefore build a drasha based on that. It's very clear that's what the work is. It was a very, very influential, also published many times, because again, it was a very user-friendly. And I guess it's 60 entries connected to ideas of faith, as on the Yom Tovim. It has a lot of parshanut, commentary on Svarim there. For example, his entry on Purim has a whole commentary on Esther. He has a commentary on Yonah built in there. He has a mini Sefer Mitzvos, enumeration of the Taryag Mitzvos under the entry for Shavuos. A lot of other really interesting things in there. Again, it was very, very, very popular. It was written after the commentary on the Torah because he references the commentary on the Torah in the Kad. So that's his second prominent or dominant work. The next one is called the Shulchan Shel Arba, the table for four. Very, very interesting, unique work. It's a book about eating, about food, with 4 different approaches or 4 different styles of talking about food, including the halacha, halachos of brachos and laws of blessings and benching and washing, proper conduct about eating, and conduct we might include health. People know the Gemara often talks about what you're supposed to eat, supposed to not eat. Philosophy of eating, what the goals of eating are, and then Kabbalah, mystical aspects of food. A really very interesting work. And he writes in the Hakdama, I wrote this so someone could keep by their table, they're about to eat, and they want to remember what they're supposed to eat, and then make brachos, and what their kavanah, what their intention about eating should be. You have it right at your table, and you can quickly look at it as a quick reminder of what the proper laws of eating are. This is a very, very, like I said, unique work that's received a lot of scholarly attention. It's cited in the Ramah and the Beis Yosef. It's quoted in some halachos, not extensively, but a few places, so it was considered authoritative. I'll mention in this context, there is some question if Bachya ben Asher is indeed the author of this book. He doesn't quote any of his earlier things, no corroboration in that sense of cross-referencing from any of Bachya's writing to this or vice versa. He has a few views in the Shulchan Shel Arba that do not or conform with his views elsewhere. some rather extreme ones about the nature of, particularly in the realm of the end of days, of what the end of Mashiach is going to be like when it comes to food. He says the exact opposite of what he says in the commentary on the Torah. He writes in the Shulchan Aruch, really completely diverging views. It's possible he changed his mind. It's possible the work was for different people, but at least it's a question whether he wrote it. But certainly most consider Bahya the author of the Shulchan Aruch. And that's gettable in Chaim Chevel's critical edition of the Kisvei Rabbeinu Bachya. I think it was republished relatively recently in another version. There's also an English translation available online of that. And his fourth work is a commentary on Pirkei Avos, also published in Chevel's critical edition, the Kisvei Rabbeinu Bachya, and also Mosad Rav Kook republished it in their commentary on Pirkei Avos, their Torah Chaim version of Pirkei Avos. They quote it there. Very similar to his other style, where he quotes a lot of different mafarshim on the Mishnayos. It reads like a kind of a compilatory compilation commentary. So those are his four major works: the commentary on the Torah, the Kad HaKemach, the Shulchan Aruch, and the commentary on Pirkei Avos.
From the Shulchan Aruch, is there an indication, because he's talking about food and health, that Rabbeinu Bachya had a medical background? And do we view him as having a strong background in philosophy as well from that work?
Yes and no. There's nothing in the work suggested he was a doctor. Most of the medical things he's citing are citations of Gemaras, which talk about food, and place in the Rambam as well. So there's nothing from that. At the same time, he certainly read a lot of philosophy. I mentioned earlier this medical work that he translated. That was a quasi-medical philosophical work from a Muslim author. He quotes what we would call science ideas. Well, they would call science, maybe we wouldn't call it science, about the power of stones. In his whole commentary on the Choshen, he has a whole passage on the power of different stones. He regularly quotes philosophy he seems to have read in the original, including Aristotle, including some of the other Avicenna, including some of the other major philosophers. So he read philosophy, again, sometimes in the original, and he read sciences. I'll mention this when we talk about the commentary on the Torah in just a moment. He definitely gave a certain amount of prestige to science. He certainly gave a certain amount of prestige to science and philosophy, but I wouldn't say we have no indication he was a doctor, medical knowledge.
Okay. And again, what was unique about Rabbeinu Bachya's Torah commentary, and what are the four paths that he talks about and how he's going to look at the different subject matters in Chumash and Torah?
Yeah, his commentary on the Torah is in some ways unique to the point that you just noted, that he combines four different drachim, four different ways of explaining these. He writes in his Hakdama, he writes in the introduction to the work, he has looked at how the Mefarshim, the commentators who predate him, have explained the Torah, and he has said there are four different drachim, four different paths that I will use to explain the Torah. These include Pshat. Now, his idea of Pshat is not necessarily the same as Rashi's. That's a whole question. What is Rashi's idea of Pshat? That's a large question, the Rashbam, etc. But it doesn't match the other ideas of Pshat. I think the best way to explain his methodology of Pshat is ideas that explain the Psukim in their context. He'll sometimes cite a Medrash or a Gemara that's Midrashic in his Pshat section if that Medrash or Gemara explains the pasuk in context. So that's Pshat. Medrash is the second approach, usually is taking the pasuk out of context and saying it has some kind of messianic significance or philosophical significance beyond the narrative, beyond the story, beyond the halacha that the pasuk appears in, taking the story somewhat out of context. Again, usually based on Medrash, although sometimes, and Chevel notes this, sometimes when he cites an idea in his Derech HaMedrash interpretation, sometimes he's using his own idea. He's not always quoting a Medrash, it's his own interpretation that is Midrashic style. It's worth mentioning that Rabbeinu Bachya's commentary is sometimes called Midrash Rabbeinu Bachya. And that could be because of his wide citation of Midrashim, really many, many Midrashic collections that he cites in there. That may be the source of why his commentary is sometimes called Midrash Rabbeinu Bachya. His third interpretation is called Seichel, Derech Seichel. Seichel here is sometimes translated as philosophy, which alludes to what I was talking about earlier. Here, it often means an idea where the psukim are metaphors for something else, where the words in context are really alluding to a philosophical idea or dispute or question, something often from the Mor Nevuchim, something from science, something where science can be used to explain the verses. That's derech haseichel. And then his fourth is Kabbalah, is a more mystical way of doing it. Derech ha'emes, sometimes called Sod. Derech Kabbalah, that's his fourth way, usually using mysticism. The Zohar at this point did not exist in the form that it would do later. Rabbeinu Bachya twice in his commentary on the Torah quotes Medrash Rab Shimon Bar Yochai, which is what we call the Zohar nowadays. Revel notes a number of other places where passages he cites overlap with that. What form the Zohar was in this point is not totally clear. How many people knew about it, what he knew about it, but certainly some of it was circulating. He also quotes Sefer HaBahir, an early Kabbalistic work that the Ramban cites as well. He calls it Medrash Rab Nechunya ben Akana, and a number of other Kabbalistic works. Even though Bachya gives credence to the philosophical, to the Seichel approach, it is very clear his allegiance lies with Kabbalah. It's very clear in many places that he considers Kabbalah the true understanding of the Torah. And as opposed to the Ramban, when it comes to Kabbalah, who is very interested in concealing, I should say, Ramban often doesn't explain to you what he means. For the most part, not always, but for the most part, Rabbeinu Bahya is much more explanatory when it comes to Kabbalah. If you sometimes don't understand something in the Ramban and the Kabbalah, then it's sometimes worth checking Rabbeinu Bahya to see what he says there. The fifth approach, which isn't called a fifth approach, but is worth noting, he calls is derech hamusar. And that is the beginning of each parsha, beginning of each one of the parshas of Shavua. Bachya introduces the parsha with what we would call a mini drasha or prom, to use the academic word. This is a very midrashic style, where he'll quote a pasuk, usually from Mishlei, sometimes from Tehillim. He'll explain that pasuk, what Shlomo Melech means in that pasuk, and then he'll weave an idea from that into the parsha. It's a very beautiful, poetic way of starting the parsha, alluding to its themes, and then he'll say, "V'zeh ma she'amar HaKosav," and this alludes very nicely in to what the Torah tells you, and he'll quote the first pasuk. And that derech is called derech hamusar, very heavily based on the commentary to Mishlei of Rabbeinu Yonah, who probably not one of his teachers, but someone who Bach was very familiar with his writings, and so he gets a lot of citation. What's special about Rabbeinu Bachya's commentary was this compilation nature of it. There are very few places throughout the commentary where he uses all four paths, all four drachim, or five. That is not the standard. But it is very common that he quotes multiple interpretations. Sometimes as Elchanan, sometimes verbatim, sometimes not. What's so amazing about his commentaries, in addition to offering his own insights, he cites what everyone else has to say. It's worth remembering, we are at a time before print, before the Nekros Gedolos, rabbinic Bible, where you could have the psukim in the middle and lots of commentaries on the side. In my view, Rabbeinu Bachya was trying to create a liquid commentary like that. One that cited everything, but not just that cited everything for you to look at on your own, a carefully edited and curated commentary. Rabbeinu Bachya often edits what he cites to avoid problems. There are occasions where he'll quote the Ramban or quote Rashi, but he'll cite it in a way that avoids some of the machlokas, some of the dispute, some of the questions that others have asked on it. And that's what's so powerful, so special about the commentary, is just by reading his approach, you get a very full picture of other kind of commentaries on the Torah. In Spain during this time, this is a period where we mentioned you have Pshat, you have Rashi, you have Rambam, you have Ramban, you have so many other commentaries, you have philosophy, you have Kabbalah, and while some perhaps would see these methodologies in conflict with each other, Bach, I think, was trying to make a point that they are not in conflict, and on the contrary, there are so many authoritative methods of interpretation that almost you'll feel overloaded by so many. I'm going to present to you the best that there is out there in a carefully edited and curated manner, and I think that is the source and secret, if you will, of the work's popularity.
And what commentators, you had mentioned, obviously the Ramban, Rashi and the Ramban, what's the array of commentators that Rabbeinu Bachya quotes and uses in his work?
So, certainly, as we mentioned a moment ago, Rashi is cited fairly often in terms of medieval commentaries. From the Gaonim, he quotes Rav Hai Gaon, Rav Yehuda Gaon. Sadia Gaon is a really important one. The state of Rav Sadia Gaon's commentary on the Torah is subject to question what we have of it. A lot of what we have from Rav Sadia Gaon appears in Rabbeinu Bachya. You'd almost recreate a commentary of Sadia based on his citation of him. So that's very important. We mentioned Rashi, the Ramban. Rashi is by far the most commonly quoted. Ibn Ezra, the Radak, Reb David Kimchi, from his commentary on Bereshis. Also, Rabbi Yisrael Tordas, who we have. Those are the main Torah commentators who he cites. In terms of Talmudic commentators, he quotes the Rif, he quotes Rabbeinu Tam, he quotes the Rambam we mentioned on Halacha and in the Mor Nevuchim and the Sefer Mitzvos. He quotes Rabachim Pekuda, Chovos Levavos. So many, and besides, I just mentioned, it's worth noting, tons of midrashim, some which we don't even have anymore. Tons of midrashic collections. We're not always sure what his source is for many of them. So again, quotes far more sources than your average medieval commentator.
What are an example or examples of what would be considered a novel, out-of-the-box approach on a topic by Rabbeinu Bahya?
So, novel is always obviously in the eyes of the eyes of the beholder. What do you consider novel? I think, and I'll reiterate this point: the fact that he'll cite something from philosophy, let's say from the Mor Nevuchim, the Guide for the Perplexed, and then right after it cites something from Kabbalah, from the Zohar, from Kabbalistic, that itself, I think, in many ways is novel. That he'll quote something from science and then quote something from the Gemara and put all these things together. That itself, I think, has a certain novel element to it. And the idea is that he's willing to take seriously in that regard. There's a view cited for Rabbeinu Elchanan, maybe from some Sadia Gaon, about the nature of the calendar. This is an interesting an example of a medieval dispute that Rabbi gets into very deeply in his commentary on the Torah. When it comes to Kiddush HaChodesh, the sanctification of the moon, I think most people who are familiar with the Rambam and Mishnayos and Rosh Hashanah assume that Kiddush HaChodesh, the sanctifying of the moon, is done through the witnesses coming and saying we saw the new moon, and the Bezin interrogating them and then declaring Rosh Chodesh. Then that is the mitzvah of Kiddush HaChodesh, one of the mitzvahs in the Torah, one of the Taryag. Rav Sadia maintained that the true mitzvah was actually the calculation, the set calendar of how things are going to work out, and the Eidim, the witnesses coming, is a backup. That way you could prove that the calculation is correct. And this is a major dispute among the Rishonim. Rabbeinu Bahya gets into that dispute, quotes it in full, quotes the rayas, quotes the proofs back and forth to this point. So that's just a very interesting example of him kind of getting into a major halachic dispute and offering his own thoughts on it. There's a polemical aspect to Rabbeinu Bachya's writing. And by polemical here, I mean arguing against other sides, particularly arguing against the Christians. There's something that comes up in the Kad, it's worth mentioning. Rabbeinu Bachya references the Christian sermons during this time. There are many indications of this, that Jews were forced to listen to conversionary sermons. The Ramban, in the end of his Sefer Bikuach, his write-up of the dispute that he had with Pablo Cristiani, mentions that after the dispute was over, the king of Spain came into the shul and gave a sermon about the Trinity, which the Ramban then had to respond to. So we know this was happening regularly, and Bachya references this was happening in the Kad HaKemach, and he responds to some of those arguments. So he, in his mitzvah, one point of kibbud av v'em, of honoring your parent, he makes a side point, and this is one of those ones you have to kind of be paying attention, that he says one aspect, one component of kibbud av v'em, of honoring your parent, is not calling anyone else father but your father. And I can't say 100% this is what he means, but it's very likely in my mind that is a bit of a polemical argument against Christians who referred to priests and certainly bishops as the father, with that was part of their title. It's a throwaway remark, and I cannot say the 100% that's what he means, but it's one of those examples where if you're just reading it quickly, you're assuming he's quoting the Ramban. If you look at Chauvel's edition, he even says, Ayin Ramban. And he is somewhat quoting the Ramban, but he adds his own ideas along the way. And that's sometimes where you find the most powerful aspects of his thought, when he's quoting someone and then throws in his own ideas. So the mix of collecting and editing and sometimes weighing into these machlokas of parshanut, of commentary, and also some of these polemical remarks, I think are some of the strongest aspects of the commentary.
Yeah. You had mentioned before that there is a academic discussion whether one of the works is truly the works of Rabbeinu Bachya. Are there other works that are incorrectly attributed to Rabbeinu Bachya? And if so, why?
Yeah, there are a number of other works that were published separately that people used to think were separate works of his, but they are actually just taken from some of his existing works. So, for example, there's a commentary on Megillah Esther that was published separately from him. This is not actually a separate work. It is these entry on Purim that was then taken and I guess played with, I guess you should say, expanded, other stuff thrown in there that is sometimes published separately. There's also a work called Sova Smachos, a commentary on the book of Eov, that it was attributed to him, but that is also not a work that he wrote. Somebody else took parts of his drashos in the Kadakemach about Shkacha Pratis and some parts of Shulchan Shul Arba and parts of Eov and put it into a commentary. There's a number of other works there's another work called Emunah V'Bitachon that is now printed in the Kisvei Ramban. It was not from the Ramban. That was also attributed to him. The reason the Sefer Emunah B'Tachon was attributed to him was because it matches very closely another work that Rabbeinu Bahya wrote, entry rather, about Achaz Kad. So that probably what people thought they were based. They may be based on each other. They are not the same work. Those are, I think, the primary works that are attributed to him that he didn't actually write, and usually they're based on things that he wrote, based on that he wrote, but not ones that he separately wrote. Rabbeinu Bachya at one point alludes to another work he wrote called Choshen Mishpat, which seems to have been a commentary about Pirkei Avos. Not Pirkei Avos, on Nevuah. Sorry, my apologies. On prophecy, he seems to reference it, but we don't have it anymore. So that's another work that may be out there that hasn't been found.
Rabbi Taubes, you've written about the story of Rabbeinu Bachya and what's called the case of the mysterious medieval lightning rod. What's that all about?
This is my, I guess, first article, I guess, getting into Rabbeinu Bachya. In his commentary on the Dor Fluga, the Migdal Babel, the Tower of Babel, this tower that's described in the Bereshis that people built to go to war with God, go to war with Hashem. Very, very difficult story to understand. So that's one of the places in the Torah where he actually offers 4 different interpretations of understanding it. And one of his interpretations, Derech HaSeichel, is what they were trying to do with this tower was to build a tall tower and then put something on top, some kind of device on top that would prevent Hashem, from burning the world, because they knew that he wasn't going to flood the world anymore, because he had promised not to bring a flood, but they were afraid of fire. And then he writes, this is similar to what some of the Chachmei Doreinu, some of the wise men of our generation know, that they know that you can put a device on a tall tower and that will capture lightning and dissipate it. It's not his exact words, but that seems to be what he says. That sounds a lot like a lightning rod, and indeed you can find many more recent commentators who thought that way. In some of the 19th century versions of Rabbeinu Bachya that have a little bit of commentary, in parentheses you have the word Dunnerbleiter, which is more or less Yiddish for lightning rod. And you have some who have said, Rabbeinu Bachya knew the secret of the lightning rod long before Benjamin Franklin had figured it out. So it's always a little bit funny because Rabbeinu Bachya didn't say this was his idea. He doesn't even call it a Jewish idea. He says people know how to do it. The question stands, what is Rabbeinu Bachya referring to? Is it possible that he knew about lightning rods? Lightning rods were known long before Benjamin Franklin or anyone else did. So I was very curious about this. So I wrote an article trying to figure out. I suggested. I mentioned some other approaches have been suggested. My own possible approach was that he's actually referring to bells. There was a belief popular among Christians at the time that ringing of the bells, of church bells, could somehow dissipate lightning. This is discussed by some major scientists later on, trying to figure out how this worked. Francis Bacon actually wrote about this. Somehow the ringing of the bells would somehow break up the storm clouds. There are medieval or late medieval lightning rods that have Latin words engraved into them, Bahya, which means I break up the lightning. Benjamin Franklin himself, when describing his plan for the lightning rod in a letter that he wrote, said, this doesn't seem to be working, this whole ringing the bell thing. On the contrary, the bell ringers seem to get struck as they're doing it. It seems to be the opposite. It's trying to give another approach. So perhaps he's referring to church bells and didn't want to say church bells because that would somehow be ascribing power to Christian liturgy and Christian rituals. A suggestion I had, I don't know if that's correct. It remains somewhat of a strange thing what he's referring to, this device on a tower that could somehow break up the lightning. So just one cute aspect of Rabbeinu Bachya's thought that I first focused on.
Fascinating. In conclusion, why should students who study Torah, who study the Bible, use and delve into Rabbeinu Bachya's commentary? And is that happening today among people who are, pick up the Torah, look at Rashi, look at a Ramban? Are people using Rabbeinu Bachya today? And is there a full translation in English for the English-speaking world?
So I'll answer your questions in reverse order. I will not follow Chazal's on our Rishon. There is an English translation done by Rabbi Monk. He's translated a number of commentaries. It is available for free online through Sefaria. There's a lot of editing issues with it, I should say. The editor inserted his own comments there. Sometimes tells you, sometimes doesn't. There's typos. I would be a little bit wary of relying upon it, but for someone who really can't read the original, it is out there, and it's worth mentioning that it exists. Oz V'Hadar, the great printing press or publishing house of our day from Monsey, if you know those other Gemaras and many, many other Svarim, recently completed a 10-volume commentary version of his commentary, which includes many helpful additions and explanations and citations, cross-references. They have their style is they have shorter points in the middle, like in the middle of their commentary, and the bottom they have longer discussions. That can be very useful if you're trying to go through it. And then you have Chevel's edition, which also has helpful haros, helpful comments. My sense is that the work is being used. I mentioned before, Art Scroll quotes it very extensively in the Stone Chumash, which is already a number of years old already, and you find people citing it fairly regularly. It's a commentary that often requires a little more work than the Rashi and the Ramban because of that compilation nature. If you see it, we're just quoting what everyone else says. So why I respond to that is, number one, if you just read a single passage of Rabbeinu Bachya, you will know what everyone says. You'll know the Midrashim. It will give you a very nice overview of the Mefarshim. But sometimes if you're looking carefully, and not even super carefully, just reading it line by line, you'll notice what he's adding. Rabbeinu Bachya, following the Ramban in this sense, but in my view in some ways even more, was interested in big ideas. He wanted to know how this pasuk, how this verse fit into the larger chapter, fit into a larger view of the entire Torah. He likes taking the psukim and touching upon greater ideas of emunah, of hashgacha, of major concepts. He also explains the psukim, but he has a concentrated effort on explaining those psukim in a larger perspective of what the Torah is about. So it's hard to know how much is caught on. I think Rabbeinu Bachya's commentary, having been republished, is a sign of his continued use. I certainly hear more people talking about it, but that might be a population bias because of my own work. But I think it offers someone a very worthwhile overview, and they're often innovative interpretations of the Torah, of verses of the Torah.
And just in final conclusion, what are you working on now, Rabbi Taubes? You're finishing up your dissertation, and what is the topic of that?
So I'm writing about Rabbeinu Bahya, specifically the Kata Kemach. I'm very interested in the history of organization of Jewish books. I mentioned earlier that alphabetization is very, very common and standard nowadays, as it has been for some time, but was rare in the medieval period. So I'm writing about the history of organization styles like alphabetization and similar tools that made books we would call more user-friendly. So the introduction of what's known as tables of contents, indices, an index, things like that, organization styles that were introduced into Sfarim, into Jewish books, that allowed readers to find what they were looking for, to use it with greater ease. So I'm writing about the history of that, again, focusing particularly on alphabetization and focusing even more particularly on the Kata Kemach, what led to Rabbeinu Bahya choosing to use alphabetization for his work.
And when is that expected to be completed?
I hope in the next year, Mirza Hashem.
Okay, excellent. Okay. Again, Rabbi Yaakov Taubes on Bachya, and we're going to keep calling it Bachya and not Bahya. Bachya ben Asher. It's been fascinating. Thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you for asking me. Take care.